Welcome to Truthology, a journey into the very essence of truth. In this series, we'll explore the fundamental mysteries of life's origin and meaning. How did we get here? Where did we come from? What brought us into existence? What is our relationship to reality as a whole? Sometimes I wonder why anyone talks about anything else. Because this is the most interesting topic in the world. If you're listening to this and you think that knowing the answers to these questions with certainty, to really have proof, is impossible, all I can say is stay tuned. I made this series just for you, so you can see, know, and judge the evidence for yourself. Welcome to Truthology. Hello, and welcome to Truthology. I'm your host, Jeffrey Libby. On today's episode, we're going to be concluding our study on the proof of God in the biological makeup of all living things. As always, let's start out by remembering why we're even doing this in the first place. To do that, I'd like to quote from Scripture, specifically 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 24 through 36, which reads, and I quote, "A servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but be gentle to all, able to teach, patient in humility, correcting those who are in opposition. If God perhaps will grant them repentance, so that they may know the truth, and that they may come to their senses and escape the snare of the devil, having been taken captive by him to do his will." End quote. So, with that said, I want you to know that I spent most of my life as an ardent atheist. I never imagined I would be a believer, let alone a Christian teacher. Looking back now, I realized that the issue was not so much that I didn't believe, but that I was simply never presented with the facts, evidence, and proof of God. Sometimes now, I think back and I wish I had been taught these things earlier. I think about how different my life would have been. So please know, if you're watching this and you don't believe, I don't think you're an idiot, just like I don't think I was an idiot or a fool before I was presented with this information. And it's only because of the love and respect that I have for you, my dear viewer, that I'm presenting this information to you in the first place, as I wish someone had done for me earlier in my life. So, with that said, let's get right to it, shall we? Some of you may have heard of what's called the God of the Gaps argument. This argument accuses people who believe in intelligent design or divine creation of inserting God simply to plug up holes where the truth is unknown. Like someone who says, for example, "We don't know how DNA was formed, so God must have made it." This would be an illustration of the God of the gaps type of reasoning. It's at this point in the conversation, however, that I often hear what I call the Darwin of the gaps argument. This is when non-theists be they staunch materialists, pantheists, New Agers, or what have you, assert that the explanation for the origin of the language of DNA must simply be some yet to be discovered magical force. And if not a mysterious physical process, they'll describe it as simply energy or consciousness. To analyze the veracity of their claim that there is surely some type of energetic or chemical cause for the complex and specific information-bearing properties of DNA that we uncovered in the previous sessions, let's look at the work of scientists Dean Kenyon and Gary Steinman. Kenyon and Steinman published a best-selling text on the origin of life called Biogical Predestination. In it, they argued that the complex and incredibly improbable sequencing of amino acids in proteins, which we discussed in previous episodes, is caused by something they called differential bonding affinities. These affinities, they thought, might be described as inherent physical properties of attraction within the amino acids. Their idea, then, was that the complex sequencing of proteins that we learned about in previous sections could be the result of some kind of either chemical or physical forces which would cause or force the pieces of the protein molecules to assemble themselves in a functional way. While this theory sounded like it could be that last-second touchdown that the materialists were looking for, like an incomplete pass, the game was lost because the theory is observably untrue. When we look at the letters on the page of a printed book, it is immediately and glaringly obvious that the book is the result of an intelligent agent purposefully conveying a message. We see this first from the specified complexity of the letters and the improbable arrangement of those letters into the information-bearing sequences that we spoke about earlier with our proverbial monkey's typewriter. In addition to their arrangement and specificity, we can also know for certain that the letters in a book were not arranged by virtue of some force or background energetic consciousness. We know this because the paper and the ink are both always the same, regardless of the letters written on it. Therefore, logically, there can be no force, no law of physics, and no miracle of the universe or consciousness which could be applied to ink and paper to force it to form into coherent characters and sentences. Instead, as we all know intuitively, only a living, conscious, intelligent agent could do that. Well, the improbably arranged letters in our book are exactly analogous to the information stored in DNA as a code made up of 4 chemical bases. The names of these chemical bases, as I'm sure you recall, are adenine A, guanine G, cytosine C, and thymine T. For the umpteenth time, I know this isn't a biology class, but it's nonetheless vital for you to understand why it's scientifically, demonstrably, and empirically impossible that the arrangement of the DNA molecule is the result of a force or law of any kind. I often use this example with New Age friends of mine who say that everything is just energy, love, the universe, or consciousness. This example is also pertinent to those who claim that this complex arrangement is all attributable to the magic of gravity. Regardless of whether their preferred magical force is consciousness or gravity, I ask my dear friends to imagine that we ran the world's most high-tech laboratory. We had at our disposal a completely empty and sterile vessel, like a petri dish, in which there was absolutely nothing. How long, I asked them, approximately, I throw in for effect, would it take for the universe, consciousness, or gravity to act upon the contents of our petri dish, which, remember, contains only 100% pure consciousness, universe, and the like? In our laboratory, how long would it take for a strand of DNA, an amino acid, a protein, or a living cell to appear in that empty petri dish? Clearly, the answer is that no matter how many millions or even billions of years you wait, it's simply never going to happen. This can be proven scientifically because we can observe how the code that is DNA is typed out or created. DNA has a sugar phosphate backbone that looks like a spine or the bones of a fish. The letters of DNA, A, C, G, and T, are connected to the spine of the DNA by means of what's called a glycosidic bond. This is important to know about because although glycosidic bond is a funny name that you definitely don't need to remember, the key takeaway is that the bond is always the same, meaning each position along the spine of the sugar phosphate backbone is exactly the same. There is no chemical difference causing particular letters to land in any given position along the spine of the DNA, in exactly the same way that there's no difference chemically in the various areas of a piece of paper upon which different letters are written. Furthermore, there is also neither any chemical attraction nor any properties of the individual nucleotide bases, A, C, G, and T, which cause them to arrange themselves in functional order. Just like different colors of ink don't cause particular letters to suddenly appear. So as you can see, just like words written on a page in ink, the language that is at the root of DNA, amino acids, proteins, cells, and the great mystery of the origin of life that we're exploring in this journey simply cannot be written off as being the result of blind chance, the universe, consciousness, a chemical reaction, a universal force, or anything else except a conscious, personal, intelligent designer like a theistic God. Anytime we see written, functional code and messages, we know that they were created by a creator or a designer. As you have seen for yourself, the same principle is demonstrably true, yet even more so for the codes inside the cells of our body and every living organism. That glaringly obvious and indisputable conclusion is why, in the end, even Dean Kenyon himself publicly rejected his own theory of biological predestination, freely and openly admitting that it could not explain the origin of biological information. This is why Kenyon is one of my heroes, because rather than stubbornly sticking to his guns, he followed the truth. I once heard a saying, which was at least attributed to Winston Churchill, where he said, "My allegiance is not to consistency, but only to truth." Like Kenyon and so many others, when I first heard this information, I myself also had to admit that my once long-standing views that life could simply have arisen by chance were provably untrue. I hope you'll learn from these stories of me, Dean Kenyon, and Winston Churchill, and you too will be able to follow the truth and actually learn. Don't be stubborn and say, just because this is the way I thought things were before, that I'm going to stick to it forever, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Instead, give thanks that you are learning and realize that's the only way to grow. It brings back memories for me of an early mentor of mine who used to say that he could tell how intelligent someone was by how many times they said either "I don't know" or "I was wrong." This is because, he explained, until you admit that there are things you don't know and really open your ears, you literally can't learn anything new or grow. Anyways, back to what we were talking about right now. I hope you now fully understand that the way in which this biological information initially came into being and created the first living cell is the crucial thing we need to understand in order to explain the origin of life. As we have seen, without this information, you cannot have life, period. Logically, there is of course no way that natural selection can ever explain the existence of DNA. Natural selection, by definition, can only take place in living things. If you don't have living things to compete against one another, natural selection and competition never even have a chance to get started. You must have life before natural selection, competition, or survival of the fittest can be a factor. Or, as the prominent geneticist and evolutionary biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky so succinctly put it, pre-biological natural selection is a contradiction in terms, end quote. Even the smallest, simplest, living, single-celled organism relies on information-rich DNA, amino acids, and proteins to function. In this way, DNA poses yet another problem for the materialists. This time, it's the classic chicken and egg problem. This is because the information in DNA is necessary to direct the construction of proteins. And proteins are necessary to process the information on DNA to make proteins. This is true even for some of the proteins involved in processing the information on the very DNA. So you need DNA to produce proteins, but you also need proteins to process the information on DNA. This chicken and egg problem shows, in yet another way, how the entire system was designed holistically and could not possibly have arisen by chance over long periods of time due to a series of slow, successive, and random mutations. Some origin of life researchers, however, have tried to solve this problem naturally by creating what's called the RNA World hypothesis. This theory speculates that life started with RNA molecules, magically appearing and automatically copying themselves. These RNA molecules would get gradually more complex and combine with other molecules, all by random chance, until, voila, life would arise. Advocates of this RNA world hypothesis assert that those who believe in God or in an intelligent designer simply don't understand the science and chemistry behind their theories. Stephen Fletcher, a British chemistry professor from Loughborough University, said intelligent design proponents simply don't understand that, and I quote, "Natural selection is a chemical as well as a biological process," end quote. Fletcher claims that prebiotic natural selection via self-replicating RNA molecules can explain the origin of DNA. The key idea of the RNA world hypothesis, then, is that without cells or organisms to reproduce on their own, you need molecules which can copy themselves and get life going. This can all happen naturally, on its own, through a series of random chances, they assert. Now, right off the bat, from what you already know about DNA and the codes within it, do you remember how long the odds are for nucleotide bases arranging themselves into a functional sequence? Do you think it's plausible that this could happen by chance? Well, in an almost comedic way, proponents of this RNA world hypothesis call this random chance process RNA or ribosome engineering. It's like you couldn't make this stuff up. How can someone not see that the very word engineering in the name reflects the fact that this isn't going to happen on its own by chance? But instead, you need engineers involved in the process. Anyways, to be clear, what these engineers do, like an author lining up block letters on a printing press, is they specifically line up or prearrange the nucleotide bases. Now, I don't know about you guys, but to me, engineers prearranging the bases in precise order sounds about as far from random natural selection and as close to mimicking an intelligent designer as you could ever get. The scientist, aka the intelligent designer, still needs to first have the idea for the experiment, and second, needs to supply the information, which is the nucleotide base arrangement, to get the process going. Otherwise, it doesn't work at all. Forget about random chance in nature or the primordial soup. Even with all this laboratory setup and the specific prearrangement of the molecules by the engineers, they still can only get the RNA to copy 10 or 20% of itself. Furthermore, even if RNA could successfully reproduce itself, which it can't, that still wouldn't be enough to come anywhere even remotely close to producing life or a single living cell. Finally, there is no plausible step-by-step path of random mutations which could create the massive amount of specified information required to go from RNA, even self-replicating RNA, to the incredible amount of intertwined, functional, and mechanical complexity of even the simplest living cell. This just goes to show, once again, that both chance and necessity fail to account for, let alone produce, the information necessary to originate life. We quoted Bill Gates previously, who said that, quote, DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any we've ever created, end quote. As is the case with any computer program, book, or even ribosome engineering experiment, this complex and specified information can only come from an intelligent source, not random chance. Therefore, as you have seen, simple chemicals or building blocks of life cannot randomly arrange themselves into incredibly complex sequences and then magically come to life due to natural forces, love, evolution, the universe, chemistry, consciousness, gravity, or anything other than a theistic God or intelligent designer. Yet still some people will stubbornly claim that the very idea of a theistic God or intelligent designer is simply off the table because it's unscientific. So let's look for a moment at what is scientific and if we can measure either evolution or intelligent design scientifically. We can test for design by looking at something, let's say, for example, the information-bearing properties of DNA, and asking ourselves, what currently known cause is there for every single other similar information-bearing code? We know, both from common sense and from our direct experience, that neither chemicals nor forces alone can create complex sequence-specific codes that convey information and bear meaning. Only intelligence can do that. So, in conclusion, we know that we are the product of intelligent design, not based on a God of the gaps argument or by what we don't know, but rather we know that we are designed based on observable scientific evidence, what we do know. Let's review the key pieces of evidence, and then we'll move on to even more ways that we can prove that we're the product of intelligent design and not random chance. We looked at the nucleotide bases that make up the letters or code of DNA and all life. We asked if these bases are somehow chemically different from one another, such that their chemical makeup or some forces acting upon them could be responsible for or cause their specific, complex, and information-bearing arrangements. We found that no, the bases are all the same, in just the same way that the chemical makeup of paper and ink cannot be responsible for the information-bearing properties of written text in a book. We asked if we change the code or sequence of the letters, also known as the nucleotide bases, will it disrupt the message and the DNA's ability to function? The answer is that yes, changes will disrupt it, just like any other code written by an intelligent author. We also learned that these changes were incredibly and vastly more likely to be non-functional rather than functional. This was called the combinatorial problem, showing that it is utterly impossible for these complex, functional, and information-bearing sequences to have occurred simply by random chance. Lastly, we can remember the RNA World experiment, where RNA failed to observably replicate itself naturally. Even with intelligence added to it by the scientists or ribosome engineers, as they call themselves, the RNA could still only reproduce a tiny fraction of itself. Furthermore, even if the RNA could successfully reproduce itself, that still would not be enough to come anywhere close to producing life or a single living cell. Finally, there is no plausible step-by-step path or random mutations that could create the massive amount of specified information required to go from RNA, even self-replicating RNA, to the incredible amount of intertwined, functional, and mechanical complexity of even the simplest living cell. In the end, once we know the basics of how a cell functions, it is indisputable that all life is the product of design and not a random chance or accident. We know this from everything we understand by observable, empirical science, our basic common sense, and our everyday experience. We know that only intelligent agents can produce complex, specified, functional information like we see in every single cell of every living thing. And we know that naturalistic and random forces, like monkeys on the keyboard, cannot produce the complex, specified, and functional information needed for all life. Once again, to be clear, this is not an argument from ignorance or a God of the gaps argument. Michael Shermer, the editor of Skeptic magazine, incorrectly summed up the argument this way when he said, and I quote, "Intelligent design argues that life is too specifically complex to have evolved by natural forces. Therefore, life must have been created by an intelligent designer." End quote. No, this is not the argument we're making here. Instead, I'm saying we have both the negative and the positive case for a God or intelligent designer. We saw on the one hand that chance and natural forces alone were inadequate to produce the information required for life. We also learned on the positive side that from our own repeated experience and observation, only intelligent agents can and do produce complex and specified functional information. The intelligent design argument is not an argument from ignorance. It's the opposite. It's an argument from knowledge. The knowledge of what DNA is, how cells function, and the obvious and indisputable fact that only intelligent agents can and do create specified and complex information and micro machines, the kind we find in every single living cell. My goal throughout this entire series is to take topics that can be considered complicated and unapproachable and to present and explain them in layman's terms which anyone can understand. In that spirit, let me conclude by saying this. You need to understand that no scientist in any country in all of history has ever made a single cell from scratch. Now, before you all start blowing up my inbox, you can rest assured that I understand that there have been experiments in which scientists have taken an existing living cell, removed a tiny piece from that existing cell, and replaced it with the corresponding or very slightly altered piece of another pre-existing cell. This is the equivalent of attaching a feather from an existing living bird to another living bird's wing. That's obviously quite different than making a bird from scratch. Similarly, I can assure you, from the year I'm saying this, which is 2021, until the end of time, no one will ever succeed in making a living cell from scratch. And when I say from scratch, I don't mean from dirt and sand either. If you still somehow stubbornly think it was so simple to form cells in the primordial soup on the early earth or from gravity alone, then why don't you just go ahead and make some cells? Even in the most modern, high-tech laboratories on the planet, no one has ever made a living cell from non-living matter. And I'm not talking about making an artificial cell from silicone or anything like that. I'm just talking about simply taking the parts from different existing cells, cell membranes, ribosomes, mitochondria, whatever other constituent, non-living individual parts of a cell you want. No one in any lab, let alone in a puddle, has ever been able to take those non-living parts and put them together into a living cell. If you think it's so easy, then go ahead and show me. If you succeed, you'll be the most famous scientist in the history of the world. If you want my advice, though, don't waste your time. As you've learned in this section, there's a reason why it's never been done, and it never will be done. It's a fool's errand, because only God can create life. At this point, I could rest my case, having proven beyond any reasonable doubt that life could not possibly have arisen by chance alone. However, just for fun, in the next episode, we're going to explore the evidence within the entire universe as a whole. Up until now, we've been looking at the micro scale of cells and animals. In the next section, we're going to shift gears and look at the macro scale of the entire universe. And there we'll see the irrefutable proof that it too was designed by God. I'll see you there. Thanks so much for joining me on this episode of Truthology. Please click like to show me that you enjoyed this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss any future episodes. Also, please be sure to check out the description below this video to learn how you can get in touch with me, ask me questions about any subjects you'd like me to cover, join my mailing list, see me at live events, and get involved with the entire Truthology community. Until then, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time on Truthology.